Hello, welcome back to this course on democracy and liberty. We are now still in this section called Characteristics of Democracy. So we have looked at the illusion of democracy, and we have looked at specifically the voter, and we have seen that there are two misconceptions actually about democracy, both with respect to the voter being very rational and with respect to the ruling minority or the representative being loyal and disinterested. And we have seen actually that in both cases this is not true, but it is a very widely held belief. And this is why we have this illusion of democracy. But I still would like to highlight that all is not negative. Democracy has a very important function when it works well. And this is what we're going to look at today. This presentation is called Democracy as a Conduit for Public Opinion. Conduit, or a valve, you could say, like a pressure valve, right? So let's go through this a couple of slides so that you understand what I mean by this concept. Now, as I said in the previous presentations, right, despite these, well, there are misconceptions about democracy, and this explains why democracy has a continued popularity, despite the fact that there are many different signs, actually. There are contradictions that we've seen before in this course regarding democracy and the fact that we have all societies are ruled by ruling minorities. So these contradictions exist. We have mounting political tensions, and democracy, nevertheless, remains popular. So the majority still resists criticizing democracy. And this is something that we need to look at. We've seen that there are two misconceptions, but why are these misconceptions still alive and kicking today, even though there seems to be, anyway, in a democracy, quite a few issues. We can see it in the West these last few years constantly, right, in many Western countries. So I think that we can highlight four different reasons why democracy still has continued popularity. So the first point is that people don't know or don't understand any other system. And this is the same actually for money and interest. People don't understand or cannot see what another system could look like. It can be a political system, a monetary system. What does it look like to not live in a democracy? It's very difficult for people who have grown up in democracies and who have received a particular education, which has constantly shown democracy under positive light. It's very difficult to then imagine what another system could be. So you don't question so much the system in which you live if that's the only system you know and that's the only thing you've ever seen. You can look at Russians, for example, who sometimes can be much more critical of the capitalist system or the democratic system because they have lived in a completely different political system. They have lived under communism. So they have a certain capability of judging Western democracy in a way that maybe Westerners cannot always. And this, for anyone who has discussed with people who have grown up behind the Iron Curtain, they can maybe testify to this. And it's the same thing with money and interest. We're so used to living in a system of inflation and fiat currency that it is almost impossible for the majority to imagine what it would be like to live under another monetary system. And this is something we're going to look at also. So that's the first point. The second point is that we are taught to value democracy more than freedom, even more than freedom. And this comes from of course, the media, but also the public education system. The whole value system in the West, in democratic societies, the whole value systems are, let's say, constructed around democracy, not around freedom. That's also why it's relatively easy to violate freedom in democracies, but it's much more difficult to violate democracy, or at least to appear to violate democracy. When democracy is violated, it usually creates a much bigger scandal than when freedom is violated. For example, through very high taxes or through different rules or laws that coerce the individual. So that's related to propaganda, indoctrination, and a certain view of the world focused on democracy rather than on freedom. And we've talked about this in the beginning of this course. And then there are points 3 and 4, which we haven't talked about up to now, which are very important as well. The point number 3 is that democracy is viewed as an improvement over monarchy. So, whatever the flaws of democracy, however bad democracy is turning out to be, for most people, it will always be better than monarchy, because monarchy has been criticized constantly for as long as we can remember. In school, monarchy is always shown as something very negative, and democracy is always shown as something better than that. Now, the reality is slightly different. It's a little bit more mitigated. And this is what we're going to see on the next slide. And then number 4 is maybe the most important point of all. It's one of the most important points, I would say, of this course, is that democracy can channel public opinion in politicized societies. And this is what we're going to look at in the next slides as well. So this is a very important point, and I will explain it in more detail. Now, first, let's look at monarchy. So the common claim is that democracy is morally superior to repressive monarchies. And in a way, it's true, yes, that public opinion could not always express itself very well in monarchies. Under many monarchies, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press were indeed controlled, even very much controlled. We can remember Voltaire, who spent a lot of time in prison under the Ancien Régime in France, but the same was true in Sweden under Gustav III, and the same was true in many other countries of Europe. So this is true, but that's not the whole story. Because firstly, we have to remember what we never are taught in school, that minority rule is universal. So it doesn't matter whether you live in a monarchy or you live in a democracy. The fact is that all societies are ruled by a minority. And this is what we need to remember, right? Point number 2 is that actually there were a lot of voting practices that predated modern democracy. In the Middle Ages, in the monarchical period of the Middle Ages, there were often voting schemes at many levels of society. So of course, society was a little bit more rigid. There were many more classes. There were guilds, right, that restricted the social mobility in society. So of course, there was a lack of freedom. But on the other hand, it's difficult to say, and actually it's not possible to say, that there were no voting practices at all in these monarchical systems. This is sometimes the impression that is given, right? But the most important point maybe about monarchies is that monarchies have a natural inclination to protect property. Why? Because monarchies are tied to aristocratic land ownership. So by nature, even by definition, monarchies had an intrinsic interest in protecting property, because the whole principle of a monarchy is actually the respect of the property that is owned by an aristocrat, whether it be the royal family or another aristocrat of a lower rank. That is nevertheless the case. And this also is tied to the fact that there was no fiat money or fiat currency in monarchical systems. It was generally based on gold. So that means that monarchical systems were much less inflationary than the kind of systems or the democratic system that we have today. And of course, inflation is an attack on private property. It is a very subtle and devious attack on private property, but nevertheless, inflation destroys savings, and it tends to be a kind of regressive tax. So it's a tax that hits the low income earners more than it hits the high income earners. So inflationary systems are not really the best, but this is what we are used to in democratic systems. So monarchical systems were often deflationary periods, which is almost inconceivable today. If you look at the 19th century, many countries in Europe had deflationary periods, meaning prices went down and real wages went up. That means even if the wage did not increase nominally, it actually could buy more goods as time went by, because the price of goods was decreasing. And this was generally the case when countries were not at war. Of course, when countries are at war, there are artificial restrictions on goods, and goods cannot be exchanged as easily, so prices will go up. But there was no debasement of the currency. So prices did not go up because of inflation, but because of other, let's say, restrictions on trade, which brought some prices up. But if you look at the end of the 19th century, most prices in Western Europe were going down, actually. And this was, of course, still largely the monarchical system. And then we have this aspect of mercantilism. So mercantilism is this system which is based on the idea that trade needs to bring a winner and a loser, right? So that there cannot be a win-win. Trade must either be beneficial for one party or the other, but not both. So it's true that mercantilism was partially linked to monarchy, because of course it also reflected a little bit the competition between monarchs, right? So from a human perspective, it was either one wins or the other, right? But we have to remember that mercantilism was also based on economic misunderstanding. A lot of trade policy and trade economics was not fully understood at that time. So the fact that mercantilism existed in monarchical systems was partially also due to the fact that there was a misunderstanding about how trade economics worked. And then the final point about democracies is that under democracies, the public domain has expanded tremendously at the expense of private property, and it has enabled the growth of the regulatory state through taxation and money printing. So these are the two aspects that I mentioned already earlier. But this, of course, cannot be seen as something positive related to democracies. This has happened under democracies, and this did not happen under monarchies. And actually, if you look at the way the states grew, this happened really when universal suffrage became the most common in Western Europe. So we can look now at the situation related to the ruling minority. And here we can take a quote from Lord Acton, this very famous quote. It starts with, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." But if we continue this quote, the rest is as follows. "Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency of the certainty of corruption by authority." So here, of course, the term bad is maybe slightly, let's say, naive of Lord Acton. It would be worthwhile to investigate further this term bad from a psychological point of view, which, for example, Nietzsche has done in terms of the master morality and the slave morality, for example. But we're not going to go into this topic now. We can just say that Lord Acton was maybe not, of course, very psychological. We're talking here from a purely political and sociological point of view. But nevertheless, you can see here that here we have a deficiency that is expressed, a deficiency in the minority, a deficiency that when the ruling minority or the leader gets too much power, he will tend to be corrupted. And this, of course, will have certain consequences, right? So part of the story is told here by Lord Acton, but it's not the full story. The full story is told much more clearly by Gaetano Mosca, this Italian historian who was part of the Machiavellian school of thinkers. And he wrote the following: "A ruling class that can get away with anything and can do anything in the name of a sovereign undergoes real moral degeneration." So you can see here the link with what Lord Acton said. But here Mosca goes further, because he says, "It is this degeneration common to all men whose actions are exempt from constraints and controls, which usually imposes on them the opinion and conscience of their fellow men." So we can see here that, in a way, the ruling minority needs constraints and controls. Because if it doesn't have constraints and controls, basically coming from, public opinion, from the majority, if he doesn't have these constraints and controls, he will tend to degenerate. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it's paradoxically in the interest of the ruling minority to be constrained. Because if the ruling minority is not constrained and controlled to some extent, it will degenerate and it will eventually lose power. And here we also connect again with the ideas of Etienne de la Boétie that we talked about in the beginning of this course, namely that servitude is voluntary. The people accept to be ruled. They even basically accept to be led, they like to be led, but they must tolerate this rule. So as long as they accept this rule and the rule doesn't go too far, then this rule is accepted. And that means that there is, in the other direction, constraints and controls, right? So this is very important, that the opinion and the conscience of their fellow men, the men who belong to the majority, they usually impose on the ruling minority these constraints and controls. So that's why we are now talking about this valve of public opinion. So the difference here between the democracies and authoritarian regimes is the following. Unlike authoritarian regimes, the successful democratic process can allow the majority to publicly sanction or reward different political forces within the ruling minority. So this is publicly, basically through the process of voting. This process can be seen, therefore, as an official and public expression of public opinion. So in that sense, democracies goes further than authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, in the sense that public opinion can express itself even better in a successful democracy. And Mosca, to quote him again, he said that the electoral function is a means by which certain political forces control and limit the action of others when it is exercised in good social conditions. This is very important, right? It means that when you are voting for parties that are not in power, you are empowering other sections of the ruling minority, and you are giving them the possibility to exercise more political power on those who hold the reins of power. So this is why the electoral function gives basically certain political forces control and limit the action of others. So basically, those political forces or those political parties or those people within the ruling minority who are more appreciated by the majority, or whose rule is more appreciated or thought to be more appreciated, because maybe this is an impression, can be an impression as well. But nevertheless, the majority can use the electoral function as a means to shift these political forces so that the rule that they're subjected to will be, hopefully for them, a little bit more tolerable. So another way of saying this is that democracy can improve and speed up the circulation of elites. And Ludwig von Mises, the great libertarian economist of the 20th century, he understood this very well. He had probably read the Machiavellians. He said that this is precisely the social function of democracy. It is that form of political constitution which makes possible the adaptation of the government to the wishes of the governed without violent struggles. So you can avoid violent struggles, rebellions, bloody revolutions if you have a democracy that functions, because democracy therefore can fulfill, and that's the last point here, right, can fulfill an important role of conduit or a valve, like a pressure valve, to release the pressure for majority dissatisfaction, but only if conditions are right. So one last point is that because of this situation, Mosca, he basically described democracy as being relatively conservative. Why? Because if democracy is allowed to function properly, it will basically reduce the probability of a toppling of the ruling minority or the destruction of the institutions through revolution. And therefore, democracy has a kind of embedded conservatism in it. And this is an interesting thought. But again, this can only happen if conditions are right. And this will bring us now to the next presentation. Basically, what are these conditions? What conditions must be fulfilled in order for the democratic process to work successfully? And this is what we're going to look at in the next presentation. Thank you.